July 11th, 1302. Dawn broke over the marshy fields outside Courtrai in Flanders, revealing a sight that defied every military convention of the age. More than 9,000 men stood in densely packed formations, shoulder to shoulder, their ranks stretching in a great arc from the River Lea on their left to the grey stone walls of the town on their right. These were not knights. They were not professional soldiers. They were weavers from Bruges, guildsmen from Ypres, craftsmen and merchants, butchers and tanners, standing with pikes and strange spiked clubs called Goedendags, preparing to face the most powerful military force in Europe. Across the field, glittering in their armour under brightly coloured banners, 2,500 French knights and squires sat atop massive war horses, confident in their inevitable victory. The Flemish infantry fidgeted under the sweltering July sun, knowing what awaited them. For centuries, mounted knights had been the ultimate weapon of medieval warfare. No infantry force had successfully resisted a full cavalry charge in living memory. Contemporary military theory held that a single knight was worth 10-foot soldiers. The math seemed simple and brutal. The French would charge, the Flemish would break, and the rebellion would end in a massacre. But something happened that morning that would shock the feudal world to its core and begin the slow transformation of European warfare. This is the story of how butchers and weavers stopped the flower of French chivalry cold, how industrial wealth defeated martial tradition, and how the Battle of the Golden Spurs became one of the most consequential military engagements of the Middle Ages. The roots of this confrontation stretched back years into the complex political entanglements of northwestern Europe. Flanders in the late 13th century was a paradox, a wealthy manufacturing centre trapped in a web of feudal obligations. The county was nominally part of the Kingdom of France, but its economic lifeblood flowed from England. The great Flemish cities, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, Lille and Douai, had grown immensely rich through textile production. Their workshops produced the finest cloth in Europe, woven from English wool by skilled craftsmen organised into powerful guilds. This prosperity created a unique urban culture where common workers wielded economic and political influence unheard of in most of medieval Europe. Count Guy of Dampierre ruled Flanders as a vassal to the French crown, but his interests increasingly aligned with England rather than France. In 1294 he engaged his daughter Philippa to Edward III of England, and 3 years later broke his feudal ties with King Philip III of France to form an alliance with the English king. Philip the Thor, known as Philip the Fair, had no intention of allowing such defiance. He was determined to strengthen the French monarchy and bring semi-independent territories like Flanders under direct royal control. In 1297, French armies invaded Flanders, sweeping through the countryside and occupying the major cities. Guy of Dampierre was arrested and imprisoned, along with several members of his family. By 1300, France had complete control of Flanders. Philip the himself toured the conquered territory, setting up a French-controlled administrative system. He appointed Jacques de Châtillon as governor of Flanders, tasked with maintaining order and collecting taxes to fund French wars. But the French occupation sat poorly with the Flemish, especially the urban craftsmen and merchants. The powerful guilds saw their autonomy threatened. French officials demanded taxes to pay for royal extravagances, including elaborate celebrations in Bruges when Philip and Queen Joan visited. The occupation garrison quartered French soldiers in Flemish homes, a daily humiliation that bred resentment. The cities split into factions. The Leliards, named for the French lily, supported French rule. They were primarily wealthy patricians and merchants who saw stability in alliance with the powerful French crown. Opposing them were the Liebarts or Klauwaerts, the Lion faction, who sought Flemish independence. They drew support from the guild workers and lesser merchants, men who had everything to lose from French taxation and nothing to gain from the occupation. In Bruges, the weaver Peter de Koninck emerged as a leader of the resistance. When he protested against French taxation policies, royal officials threw him in prison along with 25 other prominent Bruges citizens. Jacques de Châtillon, the French governor, attempted to suppress resistance through intimidation, bringing troops into the city. The pressure built through the winter and spring of 1302 until it exploded in an event that would become legend. On the night of May 17, 1302, Governor de Châtillon held a feast for his troops in Bruges. The French knights and soldiers, quartered in homes throughout the city, celebrated with wine and revelry late into the night. Early the next morning, armed insurrectionists led by Pieter de Koninck and Jan Breidel, a butcher who had joined the resistance, returned to Bruges. They had been forced to flee the city but now came back with hundreds of supporters at dawn on May 18th. What followed became known as the Bruges Matins, named in analogy to the Sicilian Vespers 20 years earlier. The insurgents moved through the streets systematically, breaking into homes where French soldiers were quartered and killing them in their sleep. According to tradition, they distinguished French speakers from native Flemish by forcing suspects to repeat the phrase "schild en vriend," meaning shield and friend. The Dutch pronunciation, with its difficult consonants and guttural sounds, was nearly impossible for French speakers to mimic. Those who failed this linguistic test were killed on the spot. The massacre continued throughout the early morning hours. French soldiers, caught by surprise and scattered throughout the city, had no chance to organise resistance. The governor Jacques de Châtillon barely escaped with his life, fleeing Bruges with a handful of survivors. Estimates of the death toll vary widely in historical sources, from as few as 300 to as many as 2,000 killed. What is certain is that the French garrison was annihilated, and many French-supporting Flemish patricians were murdered alongside the soldiers. The rebels used whatever weapons came to hand, including the Goedendag, the distinctive Flemish weapon that would soon become famous across Europe. The Goedendag was essentially a wooden staff, 3 to 5 feet long, thicker at the top and tapering toward the bottom. At the thick end, a sharp iron spike was mounted with an iron ring to reinforce the junction. Some accounts describe the weapon as similar to a baseball bat with a spike on the end. It was cheap to produce, costing perhaps 10 to 12 shillings when a guildmaster's daily wage was 3 shillings, making it accessible to common men. The name itself has uncertain origins. In Dutch it means good day, and legend connected it to the greeting the rebels used before murdering French speakers. Another theory suggests the name derives from a Germanic root for dagger, making it the good dagger. Whatever its etymology, the Goedendag would prove devastatingly effective against mounted knights. News of the massacre spread rapidly through Flanders. The rebellion became general almost overnight. Most Flemish towns joined the uprising, seeing the Bruges Matins as a point of no return. Only Ghent, the largest Flemish city, remained neutral, its wealthy merchants unwilling to risk their prosperity in rebellion. Crucially, most of the Flemish nobility sided with France, fearful that the uprising represented an attempt by the lower classes to overturn the social order. The rebels needed leadership. Command fell to members of Guy of Dampierre's family who had escaped French captivity. His son John of Namur and grandson William of Jülich, a 25-year-old nobleman, took charge of organising the rebel army. They faced a daunting task. They had to somehow forge thousands of urban militiamen into a fighting force capable of facing the most feared cavalry in Europe. In Paris, King Philip IV received word of the Bruges Matins with rage. The massacre of his garrison and officials demanded immediate and overwhelming response. He assembled a powerful expeditionary army, drawing knights and men-at-arms from across northern France. The force eventually numbered about 8,000 men, including roughly 2,500 mounted knights and squires, supported by approximately 1,000 crossbowmen, 1,000 spearmen and 2,000 to 3,000 additional infantry. To command this army, Philip chose Count Robert II of Artois, one of the most experienced military leaders in France. Robert was a cousin of the king, and had proven himself in multiple campaigns. He had fought in the Aragonese Crusade of 1284 to 1285, had commanded forces in Aquitaine against the English, and had defeated Flemish rebels at the Battle of Furnes in 1297. He was considered the best French knight and captain of his time. Ironically, Robert knew the terrain around Courtrai well, having lived there during his youth. The French army that assembled was the flower of French chivalry. Among the 2,500 mounted men-at-arms were some of the greatest nobles in France. Raoul of Clermont-Nel, Constable of France and Lord of Nel, commanded alongside Guillaume of Clermont, Marshal of France and Lord of Breteuil, and Simon de Melun, also Marshal of France. More than 70 counts, barons and banneret lords rode with their retinues. These were professional warriors from families that had trained for mounted combat for generations. Each knight wore a fortune in equipment. Their armour included mail hauberks covering the body, mail coifs protecting the neck and head, and increasingly plate reinforcements at critical points. Over this went a surcoat displaying heraldic arms. On their feet they wore gilded spurs, the mark of knightly status. These spurs would give the battle its name. The war horses were equally impressive, specially bred destriers that could carry the weight of an armoured man and trained to function in the chaos of battle. Contemporary military theory held these mounted knights to be nearly invincible. For over 2 centuries, heavy cavalry had dominated European battlefields. Infantry was considered essentially defensive or supportive, useful for holding ground or skirmishing, but incapable of breaking a determined cavalry charge. The feudal system itself was built on this military reality. Kings granted land to nobles who could afford war horses and armour, creating a warrior aristocracy that monopolised military power. Peasants and townsmen could never hope to match the expense of knightly equipment, and thus could never challenge noble dominance. The impending clash at Courtrai threatened this fundamental ordering of society. Meanwhile, the Flemish were assembling their own army. In late June 1302, forces from various Flemish towns converged on Courtrai, where a French garrison still held the castle. The Flemish began siege operations, but more importantly, they began preparing the ground for battle. William of Jülich and the other commanders understood that their survival depended on choosing the right terrain and maintaining formation. The Flemish army eventually numbered between 8,000 and 12,000 men, depending on which historical account you trust. They came primarily from Bruges, which contributed perhaps 40% of the total force, along with contingents from Ypres, Kortrijk itself, and other West Flemish towns. Despite Ghent's official neutrality, about 700 volunteers from that city joined the army under Jan Borluut. The force was overwhelmingly infantry. The defection of most Flemish nobles to the French side meant the rebels had at most 10 to 400 noblemen, depending on the source. Some accounts claim only 10. Cavalry fought for the Flemish. This was an army of common men, organised by guild and town. The guild structure proved crucial to creating an effective fighting force. Men who worked together, knew each other, and shared trade interests fought alongside their colleagues. This built-in cohesion helped maintain formation under stress. Each guild carried its own banner, allowing men to find their place in the ranks. They wore similar clothing by guild, making it easier to distinguish friend from foe. They learned battle cries unique to their contingent. The Flemish army was surprisingly well equipped for a militia force. The wealthy Flemish cities could afford to arm their men properly. Nearly all had steel helmets and neck protection. Most wore mailhaubergens, shorter versions of the knight's mailhauberk. They had iron or steel gloves and effective weapons. About 900 were trained crossbowmen. The rest carried pikes, spears, and the distinctive Goedendags. Unlike poorly armed peasant levies that sometimes appeared in medieval warfare, these urban militiamen had real weapons and real armour, purchased from their prosperous cities' well-stocked arsenals. The Flemish positioned themselves carefully. They formed their lines south of Courtrai, in an open field that appeared suitable for cavalry operations but was actually a cleverly chosen trap. Their left flank rested on the river Lys, which protected them from being outflanked on that side. Their right extended toward the town walls. Between them and the expected French approach lay terrain that looked open but was actually treacherous. Small streams and brooks crossed the field, creating marshy ground. The Flemish improved this natural obstacle by digging additional ditches and holes designed to break up cavalry formations. The infantry organised into deep formations, perhaps 8 ranks deep, densely packed. The front ranks planted pikes, creating a bristling hedge of spear points. Behind and between the pikemen stood men with Goedendags, ready to strike at horses and dismounted knights who reached the pike line. The crossbowmen positioned forward, ready to duel with French missile troops. On July 10th, the French army arrived and established camp about a mile from the Flemish position. Robert of Artois could see the enemy arrayed before him. He had overwhelming advantages in heavy cavalry and the finest knights in Europe. But the terrain gave him pause. The brooks and marshy ground complicated a straightforward cavalry charge. Some of his advisers suggested allowing the infantry to engage first, to clear a path and weaken the Flemish before committing the knights. The next morning, July 11th, 1302, Robert organised his forces for battle. He arranged the French in 3 main divisions. The first 2 would attack in sequence, while the third served as reserve. His plan was to use the French infantry to engage and disorder the Flemish, then commit the cavalry to break through and scatter them. As the morning wore on, the 2 armies faced each other across the marshy field. The French began their advance. First came the crossbowmen and light infantry, moving forward to engage their Flemish counterparts. The initial missile duel went in favour of the French, whose more numerous and perhaps better trained crossbowmen pushed back the Flemish shooters. French light infantry supported the crossbowmen, beginning to make progress against the front Flemish ranks. For a moment it appeared the French approach might succeed, but then Robert of Artois made the decision that would doom his army. Watching his infantry gain the advantage, he recalled them, pulling them back before they could exploit their success. The reason was political as much as military. The 2,500 knights who had ridden to Flanders expected the honour of delivering the decisive blow. To allow common infantry to win the battle would be an insult to their status. Many of these proud nobles would have been furious at being denied their role in crushing the Flemish rebels. Robert also likely believed that the knights could finish the battle quickly and decisively, achieving a spectacular victory that would send shockwaves through any other potential rebels. He gave the order. The cavalry would charge. The French knights formed into two massive attack formations, each containing over 1,000 armoured horsemen. They unfurled their brightly coloured banners, displaying the heraldry of the great houses of France. Officers shouted commands, trumpets sounded. The horsemen moved forward at the command forward, gradually building speed. It must have been a terrifying sight for the Flemish infantry. Over 2,000 armoured knights thundering toward them, the ground shaking under iron-shod hooves, the sunlight glinting off mail and spear points, the battle cries of the French nobility echoing across the field. Everything in their experience, everything they had been taught about warfare, said that infantry could not withstand such a charge. Men in the Flemish ranks must have wanted desperately to run. But they held. The guild organisation and the fact that each man stood among his neighbours and colleagues helped maintain cohesion. The Flemish leaders moved along the ranks, shouting encouragement. More importantly, the Flemish soldiers understood that running meant certain death. They had no cavalry to screen a retreat. If they broke formation, the French knights would run them down and slaughter them. Their only chance was to hold together. The French cavalry charge quickly encountered problems. The infantry that Robert had recalled had been trying to clear a path through the brooks and marsh. Now the knights had to cross this obstacle course at speed while maintaining formation. Horses stumbled in the soft ground. Some knights fell from their saddles. The neat formations began to break up as individual riders navigated the terrain at different rates. By the time the first French knights reached the Flemish line, they were disorganised and arriving in clusters rather than as a unified wall of force. The Flemish pike line held firm. The front rank of pikemen had planted the butts of their weapons in the ground and angled the points outward, creating an obstacle similar to a boar spear. When horses collided with this hedge of spear points, they were impaled or wounded, refusing to press forward into the wall of steel. The Goedendag wielders proved their worth in the chaos that followed. Contemporary chronicler Guillaume Guillard described how each held his Goedendag raised against the French. The iron point presented as one would meet a wild boar. The weapons had a dual function. The spike could thrust at horses and riders, while the heavy wooden shaft could deliver crushing blows. Military historian Kelly de Vries notes that the chief function of the Goedendag was to bring down a knight from his horse. Another military historian, J.F. Verbruggen, described their tactical employment. They were placed between the pikemen or in the second rank, so that with their shorter, very heavy weapons, they could put the horses out of action. As French knights crashed into the Flemish line and were halted by the pikes, the Goedendag men surged forward. They struck at the horses, using the heavy clubs to break legs and the spikes to wound the animals. War horses, trained though they were, could not advance into a wall of spears. When wounded, they reared and screamed, throwing riders or becoming uncontrollable. Knights who managed to dismount or were thrown found themselves in a desperate situation. Encased in heavy armour, they were relatively immobile on foot. Each fallen French knight was quickly surrounded by as many as 10 Flemish infantry. The Goedendag proved devastating at close range. The heavy shaft could deliver concussive blows that stunned armoured men, while the spike could be driven through mail and into gaps in armour. The battle degenerated into a chaotic melee along the Flemish line. Robert of Artois, watching from behind, saw his first wave of knights bogging down rather than breaking through. He made the decision to commit his second wave and personally led them forward into the fight. This only added to the disaster. The second wave of knights encountered the same terrain obstacles, the same brooks and marshes that had disrupted the first attack. They arrived at the Flemish line piecemeal and disorganised. The besieged French garrison in Courtrai Castle attempted a sortie to strike the Flemish from behind, but specially positioned Flemish troops quickly drove them back inside the walls. Robert of Artois fought his way into the thick of the combat, attempting through personal example to rally his knights and break the stubborn Flemish resistance. But the momentum had turned against the French. The Flemish were not breaking. Instead, they were slowly overwhelming the knights through sheer numbers and the effectiveness of their weapons. The order had been given, or perhaps arose spontaneously among the Flemish ranks, to take no prisoners. This decision, whether strategic or born of fury over French occupation, meant that wounded or surrendering French knights were killed rather than held for ransom. Traditional medieval warfare among nobles included complex rules for ransoming captured knights. The Flemish militia ignored these customs entirely. Some historians suggest the no-prisoner order was strategic, to prevent Flemish ranks from being broken as men escorted captives to the rear while the battle was undecided. Whatever the reason, the result was slaughter. Count Robert of Artois was surrounded and killed. Different accounts give varying details of his death. French chroniclers recorded that he fought bravely to the end. Flemish and English chroniclers claimed he surrendered, begging for mercy, but was told the Flemish did not understand French. One legend says a lay brother named Willem van Seftinghe from Terdust Abbey struck him down. Another account claims a butcher from Bruges cut out his tongue when he tried to surrender. The truth is lost to history, but the outcome is certain. Robert of Artois, one of France's greatest military commanders, died in the mud outside Courtrai along with hundreds of his knights. The French army collapsed. As word spread that Robert was dead and the knights were being massacred rather than captured, panic swept through the French ranks. The 3rd Division, held in reserve, began to disintegrate. Knights who had not yet engaged turned and fled. The retreat became a rout. The Flemish Infantry, disciplined throughout the defensive battle, now surged forward in pursuit. French knights who tried to flee across the same brooks and marshes that had disrupted their charge found themselves trapped. Horses stumbled, riders fell. Flemish infantry caught them and killed them. The marshland that had broken up the French charge now prevented French escape. The slaughter continued for hours. By day's end, the butcher's bill was staggering. At least 1,000 French nobles, knights and men-at-arms lay dead on the field. Some contemporary accounts place total French casualties at over 10,000, though this likely includes exaggeration or counts infantry casualties along with the knights. What is historically verified is that at least 75 major nobles died at Courtrai, including Robert Sen, Count of Artois, Raoul of Clermont-Nel, Constable of France, Guy the Maire of Clermont, Marshal of France, Simon de Melun, Marshal of France, and dozens of counts, barons and lords. The Flemish collected trophies from the dead. They gathered approximately 500 pairs of gilded spurs from the fallen French knights, giving the battle its popular name, the Battle of the Golden Spurs. These spurs were hung in the Church of Our Lady in Courtrai as a memorial to the victory. The gilded spurs symbolised the shattering of knightly invincibility. The cream of French chivalry had charged a militia of weavers, butchers and craftsmen, and the common men had won. News of the Courtrai disaster spread across Europe with the speed of scandal. The reaction was shock, outrage and fear in varying proportions depending on one's social class. For the nobility and knightly classes across Christendom, Courtrai represented a terrifying challenge to the social order. If common infantry could defeat mounted knights, the entire feudal system based on the military supremacy of a warrior aristocracy was called into question. In France particularly, nobles reacted with disbelief and anger. Various explanations were invented to explain away the defeat without admitting that infantry could legitimately beat cavalry. Most blame fell on Robert of Artois for his tactical decisions. Critics said he should not have recalled the infantry when they were succeeding. He should not have committed the cavalry to charge across unfavourable terrain. He had underestimated the Flemish organisation and determination. These criticisms had merit, but they served primarily to avoid confronting the deeper truth. A well-armed, well-organised infantry force fighting on chosen ground could resist and destroy heavy cavalry. For common people across Europe, however, Courtrai was electrifying. The Flemish cities celebrated. The victory secured Flemish independence for the next 2 years until French armies returned in force. More broadly, the battle demonstrated that urban militias, properly equipped and disciplined, could challenge noble military dominance. The implications for other regions with strong town cultures were profound. The Battle of Courtrai was not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern. Just 4 years earlier in 1298, the Battle of Stirling Bridge had seen Scottish infantry under William Wallace defeat English heavy cavalry through the use of schiltrons, dense pike formations similar to the Flemish tactics. 12 years later at Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce would use similar infantry tactics to devastating effect against English knights. These victories marked what military historians call the infantry revolution of the 14th century, the gradual shift away from cavalry dominance toward infantry effectiveness. The reasons for this shift were complex. Improved metalworking made good armour more available to non-nobles. The growth of wealthy cities created communities that could afford to equip and train substantial militia forces. Crossbows and longbows gave infantry effective ranged weapons against mounted knights. Pike formations, when properly maintained, could stop cavalry charges that would have scattered earlier infantry. Perhaps most importantly, the rise of urban economies created social groups, the guilds and merchant classes, with both the resources and the motivation to challenge noble dominance. The Goedendag itself embodied these changes. Unlike the sophisticated swords, lances and armour of knights, it was a simple weapon that any blacksmith could produce. It required no years of training to use effectively, unlike a sword or lance. It was cheap enough that every guildsman could afford one. Yet in the hands of disciplined men fighting in formation, it proved devastating against mounted knights. After Courtrai, the Goedendag became symbolic of Flemish resistance. It appeared in art and on monuments celebrating the victory. The Courtrai chest, a carved wooden chest from the 14th century, shows Flemish militia prominently wielding Goedendags in battle scenes. Modern replicas are displayed in museums and produced for historical reenactors, keeping alive the memory of the weapon that helped defeat French chivalry. The immediate aftermath of Courtrai brought mixed results for Flanders. The victory gave the county full independence for 2 years. French King Philip IV was too engaged with other conflicts, including ongoing tensions with England and his confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII, to immediately mount another expedition to Flanders. The Flemish used this breathing space to fortify their position, but French revenge was inevitable. In 1304, Philip assembled a new army and a rebuilt fleet. The French defeated the Flemish fleet at the Battle of Zierikzee and won a major land victory at the Battle of Mons-en-Pévèle. By June 1305, negotiations led to the Peace of Assys-sur-Orge, in which Flanders was forced to pay substantial tribute to France and accept some degree of French oversight. The Golden Spurs were returned to France as part of the peace settlement. However, Flanders never again submitted to the complete domination attempted by Philip IV. The memory of Courtrai remained a powerful symbol of Flemish identity and resistance. Periodic rebellions continued, including a major uprising in 1382 led by Philip van Artevelde, son of an earlier rebel leader. Though this later rebellion was crushed at the Battle of Rosbeck, the Flemish cities maintained their distinctive character and autonomy. The Battle of the Golden Spurs entered Flemish cultural memory as a founding moment. In modern Belgium, July 11th is celebrated as the Flemish community holiday, commemorating the battle. In Bruges, a statue of Pieter de Konink and Jan Breidel, the leaders of the Bruges Matin, has stood in the market square since 1887. The battle features prominently in Flemish literature, including Hendrik Conscience's 1838 historical novel, The Lion of Flanders, which romanticised the Flemish resistance and contributed to 19th century Flemish nationalism. Kortrijk itself hosts multiple monuments and a museum dedicated to the battle, preserving its memory for modern visitors. The military lessons of Courtrai spread across Europe and influenced subsequent battles. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce deployed Scottish pike formations called schiltrons in a manner directly inspired by Flemish success. The terrain at Bannockburn, with its marshes and obstacles disrupting English cavalry charges, echoed the ground at Courtrai. The result was similarly devastating for the attacking knights. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms massacred attacking French cavalry. At Agincourt in 1415, the pattern repeated with even more catastrophic French losses. The Swiss developed pike tactics that made their infantry the most feared in Europe by the late 14th and 15th centuries. Flemish success at Courtrai was an early demonstration of principles that would dominate the next century of warfare. For France, Courtrai was a humiliating defeat that nonetheless taught important lessons. French military thinkers gradually accepted that cavalry alone could not win every battle. Infantry and combined arms tactics received more attention. The longbow and crossbow were increasingly integrated into French armies. By the 100 Years' War beginning in 1337, French forces had adapted somewhat to the new realities of infantry warfare, though repeated disasters against English longbowmen showed the lessons were still being learned. The social implications of Courtrai extended beyond pure military tactics. The defeat demonstrated that common men, given proper equipment and organisation, could challenge the warrior nobility. This realisation fuelled urban independence movements and contributed to the slow erosion of feudalism. The growth of paid infantry armies recruited from common classes gradually replaced feudal levies of knights. By the 15th century, professional infantry pikemen and handgunners would make heavily armoured cavalry increasingly obsolete, a process that began at places like Courtrai. The Battle of the Golden Spurs also highlights the role of economic development in military change. Flanders' wealth, generated by textile manufacturing and trade, allowed its cities to arm and equip substantial militias. The guild system provided organisational structure that translated directly into effective military units. The Flemish victory was not despite their commercial character, but because of it. Urban wealth created resources for war that could rival or exceed traditional noble military power. This economic factor would become increasingly important in subsequent centuries, as wealthy cities and commercial states demonstrated that money could buy military effectiveness that matched or surpassed traditional warrior aristocracies. Looking back from the perspective of military history, Courtrai stands as a pivotal moment. It was not the first infantry victory over cavalry. Stirling Bridge preceded it, and infantry had always played important roles in warfare. But Courtrai was perhaps the most shocking, the most complete, and the most symbolic. The cream of French chivalry, commanded by one of France's best generals, attacking what they considered a rabble of urban militia, were not merely defeated but annihilated. Over 1,000 noble dead in a single day, killed not in battle with their social equals but by weavers and butchers wielding clubs. The psychological impact was as important as the military result. After Courtrai, infantry could never again be completely dismissed. The myth of knightly invincibility was broken. Common soldiers knew that with good weapons, good armour, discipline and the right tactics, they could defeat mounted knights. Nobles knew that charging blindly at infantry formations could lead to disaster. The tactical revolution that Courtrai represented would continue unfolding for the next century, through Bannockburn, Crecy and Agincourt, through the Swiss pike squares and the rise of gunpowder infantry. But on July 11, 1302, outside the walls of Courtrai, the transformation began in earnest. The historical memory of Courtrai has sometimes been simplified or romanticised. It was not purely a people's uprising of oppressed peasants, though popular histories sometimes frame it that way. The Flemish cities were wealthy, their militias well equipped. The battle was led by nobles, even if most Flemish nobility sided with France. The victory did not immediately end French influence in Flanders, which continued intermittently for decades, but the core truth remains powerful. On that July morning, men who worked looms and tanned leather and sold goods in markets stood their ground against the most feared military force in Europe. They held their formations when every instinct screamed to run. They trusted in their pikes and Goedendags, in their guild brothers standing beside them, in their leaders who had positioned them on ground that would negate French advantages. And when the French knights charged, expecting to scatter the Flemish like chaff, they found instead a hedge of spears that would not break, and clubs that pulled them from their horses and killed them in the mud. The lessons of Courtrai extended beyond pure military tactics into political philosophy. The idea that common citizens, properly organised and equipped, could successfully resist tyrannical authority became a powerful concept in urban political thought. Flemish guilds drew legitimacy from their role in defending the community at Courtrai. The battle became a reference point for later resistance movements, a historical proof that military might did not always rest with traditional authorities. In more recent centuries, as Belgium emerged as a nation-state with complex linguistic and cultural divisions between French-speaking and Dutch-speaking regions, Courtrai took on renewed significance. For Flemish nationalists, the battle became a symbol of Flemish identity distinct from French cultural dominance. The modern Flemish community holiday celebrates Courtrai explicitly as a moment of Flemish self-assertion. This political use of history has sometimes led to oversimplification of the actual events, but it speaks to the battle's enduring cultural power in the Low Countries. The technological and tactical details of Courtrai continue to interest military historians. The Goedendag's combination of spike and club made it unusually versatile. It could function as a short pike to meet charges, as a club to deliver powerful blows, and as a weapon effective against armour. Its relatively short length compared to longer pikes meant Goedendag wielders could fit between pikemen or in second ranks, providing flexibility in formation. The medieval military manual tradition that developed in subsequent centuries often reference Flemish tactics from this period as examples of effective infantry use. The terrain at Courtrai demonstrates the critical importance of ground selection in pre-modern warfare. William of Jülich and the Flemish commanders chose their position carefully. The river Lys protected one flank. The town walls provided security on the other. The marshy ground and brooks crossing the approaches disrupted cavalry formations, while barely hindering infantry. The Flemish improved natural obstacles with dug ditches. Every advantage that terrain could provide was utilised. When Robert of Artois saw the position, he hesitated precisely because the ground was unfavourable. His decision to charge anyway, driven by political pressure from his knights and perhaps overconfidence in cavalry superiority, proved fatal. The human cost of Courtrai was enormous. Beyond the 1,000 or more French nobles killed, many Flemish also died, though sources are less clear on their casualties. Every death represented a family destroyed, a lineage ended. For the French nobility, the loss of so many leaders in a single battle created succession crises and political disruption. For the Flemish, the victory came at unknown cost in dead and wounded, though their losses were certainly lighter than French casualties. The emotional trauma of the battle affected both sides for generations. French nobles developed deep hatred for the Flemish and desire for revenge. Flemish communities treasured the memory but knew French retaliation was inevitable. The aftermath of Courtrai illustrates the limits of tactical victory without strategic follow-through. The Flemish won the battle decisively but lacked resources to permanently defeat France. Within 2 years, French armies had recovered and were winning battles against the Flemish. The Peace of Athis-sur-Orge in 1305 forced Flanders to submit to many French demands, though not to the complete domination Philip IV had originally sought. The returned Golden Spurs symbolised French recovery of prestige. Yet Courtrai had proven that French military power had limits, and that Flemish resistance could be effective. This knowledge altered the relationship between France and Flanders permanently. In conclusion, the Battle of the Golden Spurs at Courtrai on July 11, 1302, stands as one of the most significant engagements of medieval warfare. It demonstrated that well-organised and well-equipped infantry, fighting on favourable ground with appropriate tactics, could defeat heavy cavalry. It challenged the social order based on knightly military supremacy. It advanced the infantry revolution that would transform European warfare over the following century. It became a powerful symbol of Flemish identity and urban independence. The image of 500 golden spurs hanging in a church as trophies captures the revolutionary nature of the victory. Those spurs represented not just dead knights, but a shattered assumption about the nature of military power and social hierarchy. When Flemish weavers and butchers killed French counts and marshals, they demonstrated that military effectiveness could be purchased with urban wealth and organised with guild discipline, not merely inherited through noble bloodlines and years of knightly training. The Goedendag that crushed helmets at Courtrai represented a democratisation of military force. The pikes that stopped the charge represented discipline and organisation defeating individual martial prowess. The marshy ground that trapped fleeing knights represented intelligence and planning, overcoming pure military strength. Robert of Artois, talented though he was, underestimated his enemy. He saw urban militia where he should have seen a well-armed, well-led army fighting for its survival. He saw terrain obstacles as inconveniences rather than fatal complications. He recalled his infantry when they were succeeding and committed his cavalry where they could not effectively operate. His death in the mud exemplified the complete reversal of expectations that Courtrai represented. In the morning, French knights had laughed at the Flemish infantry arrayed against them. By evening, over 1,000 French nobles lay dead, and the survivors fled in terror. The butchers and weavers had stopped the flower of French chivalry cold, and medieval warfare would never be quite the same again. The transformation in European military thinking following Courtrai was neither immediate nor universal. The French nobility, traumatized by the defeat, initially responded with denial and rage rather than adaptation. King Philip IV, humiliated by the loss of so many of his greatest nobles, poured resources into assembling new armies. But the psychological wound festered. French military commanders now had to consider the possibility that their cavalry might be defeated by infantry, a thought that would have been dismissed as absurd just years earlier. The French response to Courtrai revealed the deep tension between military necessity and social prestige. Knights throughout Christendom had spent their entire lives training for mounted combat. Their families had invested fortunes in horses, armour and weapons. Their social status derived directly from their role as mounted warriors. To acknowledge that infantry could be equally or more effective threatened the entire justification for noble privilege. Many French nobles refused to accept the lesson. They blamed Robert of Artois personally, criticised the terrain, argued that proper tactics would have prevailed, anything to avoid confronting the fundamental shift in military capabilities that Courtrai represented. Yet practical commanders began quietly adjusting their approaches. The use of dismounted knights fighting alongside infantry increased in French armies after 1302. Greater attention was paid to terrain reconnaissance before committing cavalry to charges. Infantry received better equipment and more systematic training. These changes happened incrementally and without fanfare, as no noble wanted to publicly admit that the traditional cavalry charge might be obsolete. The crossbow, which had been growing in importance throughout the 13th century, received renewed emphasis after Courtrai. French military planners recognised that missile troops who could wound horses and thin infantry formations from range were essential to softening defensive positions before committing valuable knights to close combat. The Flemish themselves learned crucial lessons from their victory. They discovered that maintaining the discipline and organisation that had won at Courtrai was extraordinarily difficult. The urban militias that had fought so effectively were composed of craftsmen and merchants whose primary obligations were to their trades, not to military service. Keeping large forces in the field for extended campaigns was economically devastating to Flemish cities. Men needed to return to their looms and workshops. This reality limited Flemish ability to exploit their victory strategically. They could defend their territory when threatened and win spectacular battles when French armies came to them on ground of their choosing, but conducting offensive operations or sustained campaigns was beyond their capabilities. The Battle of Mons-en-Pévèle in 1304, where the French defeated the Flemish, demonstrated these limitations. The Flemish army fought bravely and inflicted heavy casualties on the French, but they were unable to maintain the perfect discipline and cohesion that had characterised Courtrai. The French, for their part, fought more cautiously, using combined arms tactics and avoiding the headlong cavalry charges that had doomed them 2 years earlier. The French victory was costly and incomplete. The Flemish army remained intact and retreated in good order, but it showed that Courtrai had been partly a product of specific circumstances rather than absolute Flemish military superiority. The Peace of Athis-sur-Orge that ended the conflict reflected this military stalemate. France gained concessions and tribute, but Flanders retained substantial autonomy. Across the Channel, English military observers studied the Flemish victory with intense interest. England was engaged in its own conflicts with Scotland, where similar questions about infantry effectiveness were being tested. The Battle of Falkirk in 1298 had shown that Scottish pike formations could be defeated by combined arms tactics, with English longbowmen breaking up the schiltrons before cavalry charged. But at Stirling Bridge in 1297, Scottish infantry had massacred an English army that tried to cross a narrow bridge into a prepared defensive position. The parallels with Courtrai were obvious. English commanders began systematically developing tactics that integrated longbowmen, dismounted men-at-arms, and cavalry into flexible combined arms forces. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 would vindicate the lessons of Courtrai from a Scottish perspective. Robert the Bruce positioned his army on ground crisscrossed by streams and bogs, negating English cavalry advantages just as the Flemish had done. He organised his infantry into disciplined pike formations that held against English charges. When English cavalry repeatedly failed to break the Scottish lines, and English archers were driven off by Scottish light cavalry, the English army collapsed in a rout eerily similar to what had happened to the French at Courtrai. Edward II of England, watching his army disintegrate, barely escaped capture. The cream of English chivalry died in the marshes of Bannockburn, validating the tactical principles that Flemish militia had demonstrated 12 years earlier. The spread of infantry tactics was not uniform across Europe. In Italy, city-states had been developing effective infantry forces for decades before Courtrai. The communal militias of Florence, Milan, Genoa, and Venice were well-equipped professional forces that could match feudal cavalry. The Italian experience influenced Flemish developments, as trade connections between Flemish and Italian commercial cities included exchange of military knowledge. But Courtrai provided dramatic proof that Northern European infantry, equipped and organised similarly to Italian communal forces, could achieve comparable results. After 1302, references to Flemish tactics appeared regularly in Italian military treatises alongside discussions of native Italian infantry methods. In the German territories, the rise of Swiss infantry created the most famous pike formations of the late medieval period. Swiss cantons, defending their mountain territories against Habsburg expansion, developed pike tactics that made them virtually invincible in close terrain. By the late 14th century, Swiss pike squares were hiring themselves out as mercenaries across Europe, their military reputation built on the same principles of disciplined pike formations that had won at Courtrai. Swiss military success was so complete that their infantry dominated European battlefields for over 2 centuries. The Swiss credited their own tactical innovations, but historians note clear parallels with Flemish methods. The Goedendag's function of supporting pikemen with heavier striking weapons was echoed in Swiss use of halberds alongside pikes. The economic dimension of the infantry revolution deserves particular emphasis. Medieval kingdoms had always struggled to finance warfare. Maintaining a force of heavily armoured mounted knights was extraordinarily expensive. Each knight required multiple horses, including expensive war horses that had to be specially bred and trained. Armour and weapons represented major capital investments. Knights needed squires and servants to maintain their equipment and care for their horses. This expense limited the size of cavalry forces that even wealthy kingdoms could field. Infantry, by contrast, was far less expensive per soldier. A pike cost a fraction of what a warhorse cost. Mail armour for an infantryman was cheaper than full knightly equipment. One consequence of the infantry revolution was that larger armies became affordable. A kingdom that could field 2,000 knights might afford 10,000 well-equipped infantry for the same cost. The Flemish case illustrated this economic transformation particularly clearly. The textile cities of Flanders were among the wealthiest commercial centres in Europe. Their prosperity allowed them to equip thousands of militiamen with good weapons and armour. The guild structure provided organisational frameworks that translated economic wealth directly into military capability. When Bruges, Ypres, and other Flemish cities called up their militias, they were mobilising their economic power as much as their manpower. The armour and weapons that equipped Flemish soldiers at Courtrai were products of the same commercial networks and metalworking expertise that made Flemish cities prosperous. This integration of economic and military power was characteristic of urban warfare in the late Middle Ages and pointed toward the future direction of European military development. The technological evolution of infantry weapons accelerated after Courtrai. The Goedendag itself underwent variations and improvements. Some versions featured longer spikes, making them more effective as thrusting weapons. Others increased the weight and reinforcement of the club portion, enhancing striking power. Similar weapons appeared across northern Europe under various names. The bec de Corbin, or crow's beak, popular in France, combined a hammerhead with a spike in a configuration similar to the Goedendag. The English billhook, developed from an agricultural tool, served similar tactical functions. These weapons shared a common principle, using mechanical advantage and focused impact to defeat armour that would resist sword cuts or arrow strikes. Pike technology also advanced. Earlier pikes had been relatively short, perhaps 8 to 10 feet long. As infantry tactics evolved, pikes lengthened to 12, 14, or even 16 feet. Longer pikes allowed infantry formations to present multiple ranks of spear points simultaneously, creating a deeper killing zone that horses could not penetrate. The Swiss became masters of the long pike, but the principle was demonstrated at Courtrai. Flemish pikemen had discovered that dense formations with overlapping weapons could create a barrier that cavalry simply could not break. This insight, refined and systematized over subsequent decades, became the foundation of pike and shot tactics that would dominate European warfare into the 17th century. Armour technology evolved in response to these infantry weapons. The vulnerability of horses to infantry weapons led to increased use of horse armour, or barding. By the mid-14th century, wealthy knights were encasing their war horses in plate armour that covered the head, chest, and flanks. This armour was expensive and heavy, reducing horse mobility but providing protection against pikes and missiles. Knights' personal armour also evolved rapidly after Courtrai. The transition from mail to full plate armour accelerated in the 14th century, driven partly by the need to defeat infantry weapons. Plate armour provided better protection against the crushing blows of weapons like the Goedendag, and could better resist pike thrust than mail alone. By the 15th century, the fully armoured knight in complete plate harness represented the culmination of defensive technology, though by then firearms were beginning to make even the best armour obsolete. The cultural impact of Courtrai extended beyond military affairs into literature and historical memory. Chroniclers from different regions interpreted the battle through their own cultural lenses. French chroniclers, like Guillaume Guillard, described the battle as a tragic disaster caused by mistakes and bad fortune rather than fundamental Flemish superiority. They emphasised French courage and lamented the deaths of noble warriors, while portraying the Flemish as murderous rebels who violated the norms of chivalric warfare by refusing to take prisoners. Flemish chronicles, by contrast, celebrated the battle as a great victory of justice over tyranny, portraying the militia as defenders of their homeland against foreign oppression. English chronicles, written by observers without direct stake in the conflict, provided relatively balanced accounts that acknowledged both French tactical errors and Flemish effectiveness. The treatment of prisoners at Courtrai, or rather the lack of treatment, violated contemporary norms of warfare among nobles. The chivalric code that governed combat between knights assumed that defeated opponents would be captured and ransomed rather than killed. This system served several purposes. It allowed defeated warriors to survive and fight again. It provided financial incentives for capturing rather than killing opponents, potentially reducing battlefield deaths. It reinforced social bonds among the warrior nobility across different kingdoms. The Flemish decision to take no prisoners, whether strategic or emotional, rejected this entire system. By killing surrendering or wounded French nobles, the Flemish demonstrated that they did not consider themselves bound by rules made by and for the aristocracy. This was as much a social statement as a military tactic. It declared that common soldiers felt no obligation to preserve the lives of nobles who had oppressed them. The French outrage at this treatment reflected the threat it posed to the entire social order. If common soldiers could kill nobles with impunity, what prevented the complete breakdown of feudal hierarchy? French propaganda after Courtrai emphasised Flemish barbarism and cruelty, attempting to delegitimize the victory by portraying the victors as uncivilized murderers rather than honourable warriors. This propaganda served multiple purposes. It helped explain the defeat in ways that didn't acknowledge infantry effectiveness. It justified future French military actions as righteous punishment for Flemish atrocities. It reinforced the social boundaries between noble warriors and common soldiers by depicting what happened when those boundaries were violated. The religious dimension of the conflict added another layer of complexity. Both sides claimed divine favour. The Flemish portrayed their struggle as resistance against tyrannical oppression, aligned with Christian values of justice and protection of communities. They emphasised that they were defending their homes, families, and traditional rights against foreign invaders. French propaganda, by contrast, portrayed the Flemish as rebels against their legitimate feudal overlord, violating sacred oaths of vassalage. The French king held his authority from God according to medieval political theory, so rebellion against the king was rebellion against divine order. These competing religious narratives were standard in medieval warfare, but they took on particular intensity in conflicts like Courtrai, where social class divisions intersected with political allegiances. The aftermath of the battle created practical problems for both sides. The French faced the enormous task of recovering and burying their dead. Over 1,000 nobles killed in a single day represented a catastrophic loss of leadership and military expertise. Many bodies were so badly mutilated that identification was difficult. Families across northern France received news that fathers, sons, and brothers had died at Courtrai. The political consequences rippled through the kingdom as titles and lands passed to new heirs, many of them too young or inexperienced to effectively fulfill their responsibilities. The military consequences were even more immediate. France had lost a substantial portion of its experienced military leadership. Rebuilding would take years and enormous expense. The Flemish faced different challenges. They had won a great victory, but were under no illusions about French determination to seek revenge. Flanders needed allies and defensive preparations. The cities fortified their walls, stockpiled weapons and supplies, and maintained their militias in a state of readiness. Diplomatic efforts sought to secure English support against France, though England was preoccupied with its Scottish wars. The Flemish also faced internal tensions. The victory had empowered the guilds and common soldiers, but wealthy merchants and the few nobles who had supported the rebellion worried about losing control to the more radical factions. These class tensions within Flemish society would continue to complicate their political situation throughout the 14th century. The legacy of specific individuals at Courtrai became part of Flemish historical memory. Peter de Koninck and Jan Breedel, the leaders of the Bruges Matin, were celebrated as heroes of Flemish resistance. Historical records provide limited information about their actual lives, but they became symbolic figures representing popular resistance to oppression. Later Flemish nationalists in the 19th and 20th centuries elevated them to mythic status, sometimes obscuring the complex reality of the rebellion behind simplified narratives of popular uprising. William of Jülich and John of Namur, the noble commanders at Courtrai, received less attention in popular memory despite their crucial role in organising the victory, perhaps because they complicated the narrative of common soldiers defeating aristocracy. The military reputation established at Courtrai had lasting effects on Flemish identity. For centuries afterward, Flemish militias were regarded as formidable opponents. This reputation influenced diplomatic and military calculations across northern Europe. Potential enemies thought twice before attacking Flanders, knowing that the cities could mobilise effective forces. This deterrent effect provided Flanders with security that pure military strength might not have achieved. The memory of Courtrai served as both warning to potential invaders and rallying point for Flemish unity in times of crisis. The physical landscape around Courtrai bore marks of the battle for centuries. The field where the fighting occurred, known as the Groninger, became a memorial site. The brooks and marshes that had played such a crucial role in disrupting French cavalry charges were preserved in local memory and identified in maps and descriptions. The church where the Golden Spurs were displayed became a pilgrimage site for Flemish seeking connection to their history. Even after the spurs were returned to France in 1305, the church maintained its association with the victory. Modern Kortrijk has carefully preserved this historical memory, with museums, monuments and commemorative sites maintaining the connection to the events of July 1302. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Courtrai influenced military theory for generations. Medieval and Renaissance military writers referenced the battle when discussing infantry tactics, terrain selection, and the importance of discipline. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the early 16th century, analysed Courtrai alongside other battles where infantry had defeated cavalry, drawing lessons about the enduring importance of well-trained, well-led infantry forces. Military academies in later centuries studied Courtrai as an example of successful defensive tactics and the importance of terrain in negating enemy advantages. The transformation of European warfare that Courtrai symbolised continued accelerating through the 14th century. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, beginning in 1337, featured repeated demonstrations of infantry effectiveness. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms massacred French cavalry in a battle that echoed Courtrai's lessons. The French cavalry charged across difficult ground, into prepared defensive positions, and were slaughtered by massed missile fire and disciplined infantry. At Poitiers in 1356, the pattern repeated. At Agincourt in 1415, perhaps the most famous medieval battle, English infantry again destroyed a larger French army, with French knights dying helplessly in muddy fields just as they had at Courtrai. Each of these disasters reinforced the lessons that Courtrai had first taught, that heavy cavalry charges against prepared infantry on unfavourable ground led to catastrophic defeat. Yet remarkably, French military leadership seemed unable or unwilling to fully internalise these lessons. Partly this reflected the social conservatism of the knightly class, who could not imagine abandoning the mode of warfare that defined their identity. Partly it reflected the decentralized nature of French feudal military organization, which made it difficult to impose unified tactical doctrines. Individual French nobles commanded their own contingents, and often insisted on fighting in traditional ways regardless of overall battle plans. The French finally began developing more effective combined arms tactics and professional infantry forces in the mid-15th century under leaders like Joan of Arc and the commanders who drove the English from France. But this adaptation took over a century after Courtrai, a century marked by repeated disasters that might have been avoided with earlier recognition of infantry potential. The economic costs of the infantry revolution affected different regions differently. For wealthy urban areas like Flanders and Italy, the shift toward infantry was economically beneficial. Cities could translate their commercial wealth directly into military power without going through the intermediate step of supporting a class of mounted warriors. For traditional feudal monarchies like France, the transition was more problematic. The entire social structure was built around the military function of the nobility. As infantry became more important, the justification for noble privilege became less clear. This created political tensions that complicated military reform. Kings who wanted to build professional infantry armies faced opposition from nobles who saw such forces as threats to their own status and power. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the 14th century accelerated trends that Courtrai had initiated. Early firearms were crude and unreliable, but they shared important characteristics with other infantry weapons. They were relatively cheap to produce compared to knightly equipment. They required less training than traditional weapons like longbows. Most importantly, they could penetrate even the best armour. As firearms improved through the 15th century, they completed the process of making heavily armoured cavalry obsolete. By the 16th century, infantry armed with pikes and firearms dominated European battlefields, while cavalry survived primarily in reconnaissance and pursuit roles rather than as the decisive battle-winning force they had been in earlier centuries. Looking back across 7 centuries, the Battle of the Golden Spurs stands as a turning point in military history. It was not the first infantry victory over cavalry, nor would it be the last. But it was among the most complete, most shocking, and most symbolically important. The image of gilded spurs hanging in a church as trophies perfectly captured the revolutionary nature of what had occurred. The symbols of knightly status, taken from over 500 dead nobles, proclaimed that common soldiers could defeat the warrior aristocracy. The social order based on military dominance of mounted knights had been challenged and, on that July day, found wanting. The transformation of European warfare from cavalry dominance to infantry effectiveness that played out over the following 2 centuries had one of its crucial opening chapters written in the fields outside Courtrai. The butchers and weavers who stood their ground that morning changed the course of military history. Their discipline, their weapons, their courage, and their victory demonstrated that military effectiveness did not require noble birth or years of knightly training. Good equipment, good organisation, good tactics, and determination could allow common soldiers to defeat the finest cavalry in Christendom. That lesson, once learned, could never be completely forgotten, no matter how much the feudal nobility might wish otherwise. The thunder of hoofbeats and the clash of arms at Courtrai echoed across Europe for generations, a reminder that warfare, and with it the balance of social power, was changing forever.